Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Molly Lauder joins Trishul and Aaron for an all-encompassing look at student loans. With COVID forbearance ending soon, what are some of the options you have in front of you? She explains direct versus FFEL loans, income-driven repayment plans, and consolidation versus refinancing. Depending on your income, employer, family, and desires, there are many paths available to you. But don't get too far until you digest these key points from Molly. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast. And today we have our first repeat guest, Molly Lauder, who owns a boutique financial planning and wealth management practice in Dallas, Texas.
Hi, Aaron. Great to be here today, and thanks everybody for listening. And thanks, Molly, for joining us.
Yay, I'm happy to be back. Thanks for the invite.
It's our pleasure. So Molly joined us on episode 23 to discuss her student loan story and how she paid them off with the fast and furious method. Over the last few weeks, Trish and I have been revisiting some of our past topics, going deeper and explaining more of the complexity and nuance. And one of the things that we're looking at, getting questions from clients, is the COVID forbearance of student loans is scheduled to end in September. So with a couple months coming up and some things to be able to help clients with make these decisions, we asked Molly to come back because when she was first here, it was right when the first COVID forbearance was enacted. And so now that it's going to be ending soon, a lot of our clients and hopefully our listeners at least have some questions about what do we do now? So Molly was the perfect person to bring on as the expert in this regard. So Molly, with COVID forbearance coming up in a couple months, or at least the decision-making process for people, or going back what's happened since March of 2020, do you mind going even deeper on student loans and kind of practical advice for people who have student loans outstanding?
Absolutely. So as a reminder to anyone listening who might not know what COVID forbearance is, again, just like Aaron said, it started in March of 2020. It is a zero interest and zero payment due period that will go or has gone from March of 2020 through September 30th of 2021. There's been, a teeny bit of chatter still in the news about is it going to get extended further? Interestingly enough, Senator Warren actually just tweeted saying, "What are student loan lenders going to do about helping families once payments start again in October?" And since she's very progressive, that suggests that even they've accepted that student loan payments will resume in October. So we feel pretty confident that that's going to happen. So for a lot of people who have maybe graduated in December or May of last year or May of this year, you've never made a student loan payment, so you don't maybe know what to do. Interestingly enough, in some of the student loan files that I see, we're getting really wonky next payment due dates listed. So if you, for example, use Nelnet, we've heard that the first payment isn't due until 2023. And so if you're a new borrower, that sounds great. It's probably a glitch. You're probably going to owe some form of payment here at the end of this year. So there's so much confusion going on right now about COVID forbearance. I guess one of the biggest questions that we get is, should I pay it? Should I make payments during this 0% interest period? And I think that that's a very interesting question that we need to kind of start from the beginning and get to know your student loans. I use the fast and furious method, meaning I wanted to get rid of these suckers as soon as possible. Now that I know what I know, I don't know that would have been my choice. I actually just did a bunch of math on it, and I was able to save myself about $20,000 worth of interest paying in the way that I did. But it also included, sacrificing a lot of a lot of things, waiting longer to buy a house, maybe not going on some of the, fun vacations that we saw a lot of our friends going on. And so, there's a lot of sacrifice. If I had been able to refinance at, say, 4% for 10 years, my payment would have been $200 to $500 less than what I paid per month over the 6-year period that I paid them off. And it would have been the same interest savings. So it's just really interesting. You don't have to refinance. You can also look at income-driven repayment, which we're going to talk about. But should you make payments right now when there are 0% interest and 0 payments required, really depends on what your goal is. So if the goal is to, for example, pursue public service loan forgiveness, if you work for a government or nonprofit, no, the answer is no. Don't make any payments. You want to pay the least amount possible and get the largest amount forgiven. If you're going for long-term forgiveness, say through an income-driven repayment plan that's 20 or 25 years, the answer is no, because you're going to get a balance forgiven. If you want to be done with the suckers, then it's not a bad idea to make some payments now.
Okay, so you have me worried just a little bit. I have one client case in particular. Her company stock had a public listing, and so they were able to sell some company stock. So we set aside enough cash to pay off the student loans. But because they were in forbearance, it was kind of, well, why do we pay them off now? Let's just hold the cash until September. And if there's no other forbearance, no forgiveness, then we'll pay it off at that point. So kind of, she has the cash, she's ready to pay it off. Again, it's come from a liquidity event, so that's not always the same thing. But my recommendation was wait until September, either for more guidance on forbearance, let's see if there's any forgiveness, or at the very least, maintaining flexibility. Because, I mean, the cash is not growing, so it's not necessarily a growth strategy of like, we're going to eke out 0.1% on the interest in cash and pay 0%. But I think it's more the flexibility side. So now I'm curious, was that a good recommendation?
Yeah, that's not a bad idea at all. I mean, especially because she has the entire balance sitting in a savings account. That's not a bad idea, because as far as forgiveness goes, the latest guidance is that, with Biden's latest infrastructure bill, it's not making the cut. So it was a huge campaign thing. Is it going to be 50,000 of forgiveness, 10,000 of forgiveness? What's going to be next? It's not really making the cut so far. And not to say that it won't come later. It's likely that maybe a new repayment plan option is going to come out, but it takes about 2 years for that to be put into place. And so as far as forgiveness goes, it absolutely makes sense to keep that option open. What I meant as far as making some payments now is, if you have any kind of trouble budgeting or want to get used to that student loan payment, you could absolutely start making payments. If you have the entire balance just sitting there ready to pay it off, then absolutely don't make any payments now. So again, every situation, every single person I talk to, it's different as far as what the guidance is and should be.
Okay. Thank you for calming me down, like making me feel just a little better.
And then Molly, I just wanted to also clarify what you meant about the forgiveness. Let's say you do have a forgiveness period of 10 years. Does this forbearance period count towards that period?
It does. So there's a little caveat I have to make to that. That's what we're here for today. Yes. So there are actually 4 things that need to be the case for public service loan forgiveness, which is the 10-year option. And a lot of people might not know this, so I should probably go through those. For public service loan forgiveness, which again is 120 payments. So, here, I'll just jump in. You have to have direct loans. So there are 2 types of loans that we see most commonly. And you can find these by visiting studentaid.gov and downloading your Fed file. So you have to log in, and then you can download your data about your loans. You can probably also see the description of your loans with your servicer. So whether that's Navient or Nelnet or FedLoan, et cetera, that you would usually see either the word direct in your loan. The other option that's most common is FFEL or FFEL loans. FFEL loans don't count for public service loan forgiveness. So the option there is that you would need to consolidate out of FFEL into the direct system in order to be able to even apply for public service loan forgiveness. Interestingly, that's one of the main reasons people get rejected for public service loan forgiveness, because you think, I'm a teacher, or I worked in the military, or I've worked for this nonprofit for 10 years. I'm going to just apply for this thing, and you'll immediately get rejected if you don't have the right type of loans. The second one is you need to be on an income-driven repayment plan. So the ones currently that you'll see most often are repay, revised pay as you earn, pay as you earn, income-based repayment or IBR, and then sometimes you'll see income contingent repayment. But you need to be on one of those plans. If you, for example, check all these other boxes but are on the wrong income-driven repayment plan, there is something called temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness, where you could potentially still get your loans forgiven despite being on the wrong plan, but you have to check all the other boxes. So we have direct loans as the first box to check. Be on an income-driven plan is the second. The third is you need to work full-time for a qualified employer. So that's an interesting definition on its own. It is, I want to say, either 30 or 35 hours, or the employer's definition of full-time, whichever is greater. So interestingly, if you've got, a company that you work for that says 35 hours is full time, you don't have to work 40 hours a week in order for it to count. But if their version of a week is 50 hours, you're stuck with 50 hours. So number 3, work full time for a qualified employer. And then number 4, make 120 qualifying payments. So for example, if you have an FFEL loan and you make 80 payments on your FFEL loans, unfortunately, they don't count. So step 1, you got to get into the direct system, which is as simple as consolidating your loans into a direct consolidation loan. Trishul, I can't remember your original question, the 10-year thing. Oh, do they count during COVID forbearance? So yes, they do. We have to give Fed Loan is the only servicer that can count PSLF payments for you. So we're going to have to give Fed Loan some time to reorganize their payment count, because there's probably going to be a lot of people sending in things at the same time in the next several months. But essentially that is the servicer that you need to use to ensure that your payments counted. But if you check all these boxes starting in March of 2020 and say you took out loans or needed to start repaying in December of 2019, you should have credit for all of these months as long as you're working for that qualified employer.
Right.
So I guess one of the things you can answer this later if you want to, but you said to refinance to a direct loan. Is that a
consolidate? It's a different thing.
Okay.
So that's a very common, I'll say, synonym out there, but it's not actually a synonym. So when you refinance in student loan world, you are leaving the federal system, which is totally different. You have a private lender that's buying your loans. When you
that's the SoFi ads I've seen.
Exactly. SoFi, Common Bond, Laurel Road, all those types of companies. If you are consolidating, then that is just basically the federal system is buying whatever loans you choose. You don't have to consolidate all of them. You're buying, say you have 3 FFEL loans. You can check a box next to those 3 and it'll issue a new direct consolidation loan within the federal system.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt you, Trishul.
No worries. I was just going to follow up on the qualified employer question, because that seems like a big one that would make a distinction here. Do you have any insight on what that might entail to be a qualified employer for this plan?
Yeah. So easiest way to think about it is, so actually on the public service loan forgiveness form that you need to fill out pretty regularly, any kind of government job is included. That's kind of the first one it asks you. Do you work for the military or for the government? You could check that box if you do. If you work for a 501c3 company, which is to say any nonprofit. So if you work for a symphony or if you work for an art museum, or if you work for any other nonprofit, as long as they are a 501c3, that's an easy box to check. There are other ones that are not 501c3 from a tax perspective, but they file a different tax return, but they still count. So there's a whole other caveat down there. The good news is that if you work for your employer and they are a public service loan forgiveness kind of qualified employer, they generally know that. So you could take the form to them if you're not sure and say, have you ever seen this before? And it's generally pretty, but I mean, so any hospital, for the most part, other than Kaiser in California, generally works. And the reason Kaiser doesn't is because the physicians, for example, are contracted. And so it's actually, that doesn't count for public service loan forgiveness. But most hospitals do. So if you're coming out of medical school and starting residency, you've got to waive your grace period during residency or your deferral during residency and get straight on public service loan forgiveness. But if you're going into private practice, that won't count. Even if you work at a hospital, if you're your own employer, that doesn't count. So it's working directly for some form of nonprofit company or government.
That's good to know, Molly. So it sounds like the big picture here is, let's say you have a ton of student loans and they happen to fit in all four of these categories to qualify for the public service loan forgiveness program. Then what you're saying is potentially after 120 payments, the rest of that loan would basically disappear.
Correct. Tax-free.
Well, I was going to ask my question, because a lot of kind of normal loan forgiveness, like if you file for bankruptcy or you negotiate with a credit card company, that negotiation, whatever you don't pay, is taxable. So that's really interesting that it is specifically tax-free, if I understand it correctly.
And that's only with the public service loan forgiveness specifically. There are other types of loan forgiveness. So maybe I'll just start from the beginning of, if I'm somebody that gets my first, bill in the mail saying that I'm going to owe these student loans in October, what do I do? And I think we'll go through a lot of those different options available. Does that sound good? Can I just start from the beginning?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I would do to anybody who's listening that has student loans is, and specifically federal student loans, is to log into studentaid.gov and find your student loan file. And it's a really ugly text file, but you might also just see a summary of your loans, and that would be good enough. You want to first look to see, do I have direct loans or FFEL loans? If I have a whole long list of FFEL loans or parent plus loans, things like that, then you've got a little bit more complicated of a situation. You'll be able to see your loan date, your outstanding principal, your principal as of date, any outstanding interest. Interestingly, right now, if you're looking for your interest rate, you're actually not going to see one. You might see interest rates on old loans that have already been paid off, but it's really hard to find your interest rate right now because of COVID forbearance. So generally speaking, they're about 6% on average. So assume that's about what your interest rate is. If you're on any kind of income-driven repayment, or you think you are, you want to make sure and verify that, because you might think you applied for it and you don't see it there because maybe you're in a grace period, or maybe the servicer hasn't gotten around to it because of COVID forbearance. So that's definitely something you want to verify, especially if you're going for the forgiveness track. So you'll see when that repayment plan began, and your IDR anniversary date. So if you're on any kind of income-driven repayment plan, that's another thing that, because of COVID forbearance, is a little off right now. But generally speaking, when you're on an income-driven repayment plan, you'll need to recertify your income on an annual basis to verify that you still apply for this income-driven repayment plan. So again, I wouldn't worry about it quite yet, but just know that that's something that you're going to need to do, and you'll be warned of that. You'll see a next payment due date, which again is another thing that's probably not accurate. I think I mentioned, we're seeing due dates in 2023. That's not something I would rely on right now, especially if you're a new borrower. I would plan on a payment in October of this year. Just be ready for that so that you're not surprised. And then you'll also be able to see who your servicer is. So is it FedLoan? Is it Nelnet? Is it Navient? All those kinds of companies. As far as which one's the best, generally speaking, none. Generally speaking, it's really hard to get a good servicer. When I got out of grad school in 2013, I had Navient, and I just so happened to have an incredible group of service reps that happened to answer the phone every time I called. From what I understand, they've gone downhill big time. So when it comes to, getting help, I rarely recommend trying your servicer because there's a conflict of interest there. They get interest from you. And they get paid for servicing the debt. And so they might not be able to provide you with the clearest answer.
So,
go ahead.
Molly, with the income-driven repayment, so when does that actually enter the picture? Is it before it sounds like you get the first statement about your loans, or when you're applying for the loans, or when you first get a job? When does that actually enter the picture?
So whenever you apply for an income-driven repayment plan, so let me back up just a second. If you are in a grace period right now, if you have just graduated, say in May of this year, you can't apply for one yet until your grace period is over unless you consolidate your loans. So very interesting thing, but I've had a couple borrowers go on and try to apply for it and they say you can't because you're in a grace period, and then they don't give you another option. You can consolidate your loans in order to skip the grace period and go ahead and have your months start counting. But essentially you apply for an income-driven repayment plan. If you've had your loans for 5 years, you can do this today. You can do it tomorrow. But you'll apply for it, and they actually go back and grab your latest tax return. So, there might still be some people that have extended and haven't filed 2020 yet. They'll either grab your 2019 or your 2020 tax return to see what your income was. And when I say income for income-driven repayment plan, they're actually looking at your adjusted gross income. So on a 2020 tax return or 1040, that's line 11, if you're curious what your AGI was. But essentially things like saving in a health savings account or a 401k or a traditional IRA reduce your quote unquote salary and make your AGI lower. And so that's the number for people to look at in terms of how your payment is calculated.
So it sounds like a pro tip is if you want to get on top of the income-driven repayment plan, just be mindful of when that first payment would be due, and then kind of jump on the application for that around then.
Yeah. So if you have direct loans, your first payment won't be due until October. So you can go ahead and apply for all of this and have it set and ready and waiting, and your payment won't be due till after COVID forbearance ends.
If I had a direct loan, I was working for full-time for a qualified employer, I've already made a few payments, but not under the income-driven repayment plan. I'm actually just paying whatever the bill says to pay. Would that count towards the 120 qualifying payments? Or does it have to be all payments on that IDR?
That's actually a bigger question than you intended probably. But so when we leave school, we are put on the standard 10-year. So the standard 10-year does count, meaning you're given a payment plan that would pay your loans off over 10 years. So if you've made a few payments on a standard repayment plan, then you're okay. The problem is servicers love to skip those. So you're going to have to do a little bit of fighting to make sure those payments count. If you're on something like a graduated or extended repayment plan, then generally speaking, no, those won't. You can always fight that with temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness, which again is the only reason you would qualify for that is you have to check all the other boxes, but you were on the wrong income-driven repayment plan. The other glitch or the other unfortunate thing about temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness is that you have to wait until you have your 10 years worth of credit. So if you're, 2 years into your job out of grad school and you have a few months, in the first year that we're on the wrong repayment plan, you can't apply for TEPSLF until you're 10 years. So you have to remember that basically.
Sorry, I'm chuckling at how many acronyms we have. Like I just learned income-driven repayment plan is IDR. We have the FFEL, the PSLF, and then I think you just added The
TEPSLF.
TEPSLF.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Oh, and there it just goes on and on and on. I remember when I got into business school, there were so many acronyms for things like iBanking was investment banking, and there's just so
Yeah.
much jargon that I laughed at the beginning, but the more you talk about it, the more it takes over. So I'll try not to use the acronyms too much. I'll try to, say it fully, but yeah, it just becomes part of your language essentially. But
Molly,
ahead,
also
Trishul.
with the direct loans, is there any difference with these repayment plans if it's a direct subsidized or direct unsubsidized?
Short answer is no, in terms of your payment that's calculated. As far as subsidized versus unsubsidized, there are some intricacies depending upon which repayment plan you choose. So there's some interest subsidies within the first 3 years for subsidized loans under a couple of the repayment options. And so they're small changes, but depending upon your loan balance, they could be larger change. If you have $400,000 of student loans, then an interest subsidy would certainly be of interest. But generally speaking, subsidized means that your interest is subsidized while you're in school. Unsubsidized means it's not. And so you get a little bit more of the benefit while you're in school. And then once you're out, you just got to start paying them back. So
does subsidized usually mean 0 or does it usually mean lower?
Well, generally speaking, so my subsidized loans in grad school were 6.8% and my unsubsidized were 7.9%. So you'll generally have a different interest rate amongst the two no matter what. But the interest is fully subsidized while you're in school on subsidized loans.
So for your first year, the loans you take out to pay for your first year, you don't, there's no interest charged if they're subsidized until you've
in repayment.
graduated. Okay.
Not even graduated, because you get a 6-month grace period when you graduate. So it's when you're in repayment is when the interest is. Another thing that's interesting is when you leave your grace period, your interest is capitalized. So there's all this is just a really, really complicated universe we're talking about today. But it's really important to, and I would even say try to do all of your research, but the issue is there's so much out there that is conflicting on student loans. So let me go back to where I was, my little storyline I was going through of what to do if you have student loans that are going to be due in or starting again in October. So we've just gone through what studentaid.gov can provide you, which is all the details on what your loans are. So the next thing to think about is one thing that we had thought about talking about today is, if I have 50,000 of loans or if I have $400,000 of loans, how do I decide how to pay them back? And the answer is it really depends. We love that in financial planning, that it depends. But for one, do you work for a nonprofit or not? Or could you or not? You never want to go and work for a job that maybe doesn't pay you as well in the nonprofit space because of your student loans. You don't want to sacrifice any part of your life because of that. But it's a consideration to do the math and say, if I could find a teaching job that I really loved, or if I could find, a finance job for a nonprofit that I really loved for a decade, then it's really compelling to have your balance forgiven tax-free. Other things to think about is what's your family size. So interestingly, when they're calculating an income-driven repayment, they look at your family size and basically the poverty level for your family size, which is a federally mandated number. And that's subtracted out of your adjusted gross income. If you're looking at repay, pay, IBR, the more traditional repayment plans, it's 150% of your poverty level is subtracted. So if you have 3 kids and you're married and you get out of grad school, you have a family size of 5. So that's something that will decrease your payment. If you're a single person just got out of school, then you're a family size of 1. But if you get married in a few years and then start having kids, your payment would go down over time because of that, if your income didn't change. So not only do you have to think about how much money am I making, the second piece is what's my family size and will it change over time? So continuing from there, so do I work for a nonprofit? What's my family size and will it change over time? That's when you can jump over to, okay, what's my income? So again, we're looking at the AGI on a tax return. Ways you can make your payment lower is to try as hard as you can to max out your 401k. If you happen to work for a place that has a 401k and a 403b and you can contribute to both, you could reduce your income even further. For some people, if you're getting out of grad school and you're making much lower than you anticipated, so certain types of work do that. You get this really incredible degree and then you're stuck at a lower income. It might not be possible to save $20,000 a year, but could you start with saving $3,000 a year and then maybe take it up 1% per year to basically make your retirement picture look better, but also make your income look lower? So if you get a cost of living raise of 3% and you increase your 401k savings by 1%, then, you're not going to notice the difference necessarily on an annual basis, but it's good for your income driven repayment plan and it's good for your retirement. So that's something that I always recommend. There are ways to make your income look lower.
So this actually kind of brings up a quick thought. A few weeks ago, Trish and I discussed the mega backdoor Roth available in some companies' 401k plans. And in this case, if the company plan allows it, you can contribute more than the $19,500 for 2021. You can actually go up to $58,000, but that is an after-tax, non-deductible contribution. Now, the
Correct.
strategy is because it's non-deductible, you then do a Roth conversion, especially if the plan allows an in-plan Roth conversion. But I want to clarify with both you and Trishul, it's only the 19.5 that affects your AGI. Everything above that, because it's specifically non-deductible, is still part of your AGI. It does not reduce your AGI by contributing more than the 19.5 in your 401k if you're able to.
Correct. Yes. So it's only the deductible portions of anything that you save. So a health savings account is the same principle of, if you're able to save $3,000 a year in a health savings account, that is sort of, it's, I guess, above the line, right? Like it basically, it reduces your income above the line. And then
that's
anything
interesting.
else.
So if you have student loans and you happen to be at a qualified employer and you could contribute to a 401k or 403b or even both, or if some of them government plans might have a 457, if depending on how high your income is, you could kind of, I almost want this like some math to do. Like you might even be better off contributing more to the HSA than, for example, an after-tax 401k contribution.
Oh yeah, you can play with all of this.
That's interesting.
Almost everybody I talk to loves Roths, right? We all love a Roth. The idea of not having to take money out later and the idea that any money you do take out is tax-free is really attractive, except here. Like we don't want to do that here because, another option is, say I'm a teacher and I am making $45,000 a year and I have $120,000 of student loans and my spouse makes, this would only be in non-community property states, but my spouse makes $120,000, plenty for us to live on. I could max my retirement savings to make my income look lower and we could file separately. Oh. So, there's all kinds of complications that you can do to make your income look lower. The married filing separately, that was actually going to be my next point, is a big, big question mark because there are times when it works, but there are times when it doesn't. Because if you have drastically different incomes, like basically the example I use, but if it's like 45,000 and 300,000, if you file separately, you're going to be heavily penalized for that, just based on the incomes being so different. And then you also lose out on a lot of other benefits from a tax perspective. And so, however, in states like California, which is a community property state, there is a mandatory splitting of incomes. So basically add up your two incomes together, two spouses' incomes, and divide by 2. So if I borrowed and I have an income of 200,000 and my spouse doesn't work, then in a community property state, I can make my income look like 100,000 instead of 200,000. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, to file separately.
Interesting.
Community property states, it's usually something to look at. So I'm in Texas, also a community property state. It's certainly something to look at if you have a really high income and maybe your spouse doesn't work, because you can make your income look lower for the income-driven repayment options.
So you could even do the married filing jointly, but even the higher income, if you are maxing out 401k, maxing out HSA, you can probably get your AGI down to, probably reduce it by what, 30K-ish or so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you do the married filing separately and reduce your AGI by another 30K, and your AGI looks a lot lower for that income-driven repayment plan, the IDR.
Yes. And
I'm
so
picking up on the acronyms.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the married filing separately game, I mean, I think it's definitely worth working with some sort of tax pro to just do the projection for you to make sure that it's the right step for you as a family, because filing separately is more complicated. But if it can save you, basically what we want to look at is what's the difference in your payment versus what's the penalty from a tax perspective. And interestingly, a lot of tax professionals, CPAs, EAs, other than that, like don't know that. They just think from a tax perspective. They don't think of the benefit from an income-driven repayment plan option. I mean, if you can do this married filing separate and max out your savings on your side of the married filing separately, I mean, it could make $500 a month worth of difference. And maybe you're penalized a couple grand per year by filing separately. But if you save $6,000 to $10,000, then it's worth doing, So essentially you want to look at what's your balance, what's your family size, what's your income, and what can you do to make it look lower. This is all just if income-driven repayment is the right option for you. So like that's another whole other thing. But once you do that, you actually can put in your AGI numbers on studentaid.gov. They have a loan simulator that's not always perfect, but it'll give you a general idea of what your payment would be. And then the only thing that I don't feel it does well is the filing separately kind of trick. And so, basically, once we get to the income-driven repayment options, repay, revised pay as you earn, and pay as you earn are 10% of your discretionary income. And that's where I was getting into the complicated family size poverty level calculation earlier. But essentially, here's what it is. And I'm probably going to just do a horrible job of explaining this. But if you can imagine parentheses, this is a good old-fashioned math equation. Your AGI minus 150% of your poverty level based on your family size. And then that times 10% is how you calculate your annual payment, and you divide that by 12 to see what your monthly payment would be.
So in this case, they're defining discretionary income as AGI minus 150% of the poverty level?
10% of that
times
is
10.
Your discretion.
Okay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh, that's it. 10% of that is discretionary income.
Yes. So we're taking all of our income minus what our family's poverty level would be, or 150% of that. And then 10% of that number is what is calculated as the discretionary income, as opposed to income-based repayment, IBR, that is 15% of your discretionary income.
So there's income-driven repayment is IDR, income-based repayment is IBR.
Yes, and those a lot of times B are confused.
B and D sound very similar.
Yes.
Okay.
So repay and pay are the most recently passed income-driven repayment plan options, and those are 10% of your discretionary income. So I think I misspoke earlier. Your AGI minus 150% of your poverty level is your discretionary income.
Okay, that's what I thought I was clarifying.
Yeah,
okay.
Essentially it's the money over what, if you were living in poverty, you're making,
Okay.
So it's the extra money, and then your income-driven repayment is a percentage of that discretionary income.
Okay, that's kind of what I was clarifying. That makes sense. Okay.
Yes. So what I like to do is look at what your standard 10-year payment would be. So if the easiest thing to do is you can actually pull up an Excel spreadsheet and look for amortization table and put in, say your loan balance is $100,000 over 10 years. Again, average interest rate right now, since we can't really find our interest rate, is 6%, and that'll spit out a payment for you. So that would be your monthly payment if you just paid on the standard 10-year that we all get put into. Then you can look on the studentaid.gov loan simulator what your income-driven repayment options are.
Sorry, I just kind of chuckling. Excel is kind of available to everyone. Not everyone has their handy TIBA2 Plus financial calculator.
Exactly.
But when I did that $100,000 over 120 payments at 6%, It was $11.10 per month.
Not cheap, right? Like your
Yeah.
10-year is not cheap. The good thing about student loans versus other kinds of loans is that it's simple interest. So your interest doesn't get capitalized or added to the principal balance on an annual basis unless certain things happen. So generally speaking, the 100,000 stays the same unless you pay a chunk of it off. You don't add the interest back. So that's a little bit different from like a mortgage, for example. But
Okay,
yes,
then my
that
math
first,
is wrong.
yeah, I mean, the first payment is probably, here, let me just. So the first payment on a 10-year is $11.10. That's right. It's just how much you pay off principal versus interest over time is different in a simple interest model. So if $11.10 is like, nope, not going to be able to do that. And say your income is 45,000 or so under these income driven repayment options. So in my model, I'm using 100,000 of loans, family size of 1, income of about 45,000. Your payment under repay and pay is $196 a month.
Wow.
So that's how drastically we're talking about changing your repayment based on your income. And if you can make your income look lower, it goes even lower than that. So if you were in school, for example, in 2020 and had zero income, then you're probably looking at zero payments for the rest of 2021, because they're connecting to your 2020 tax return. And if you had no income in 2020, then your payments will be zero for the rest of the year.
That kind of suggests that you want to get on IDR as soon as you finish school, because it's likely going to look at a tax return that has a far lower income than when you start working.
Exactly.
I almost wonder if there's like a behavioral side of someone who just graduated college doesn't have to pay anything on their student loans. Then they get a sticker shock when they start earning income and they have to start paying. Did they like mentally account for that upcoming student loan payment next year, or have they already started spending it?
Exactly. So I talked to some people who have, $45,000 sitting in their savings account because they're not sure what their payment's going to be and they're terrified. That's a great place to be because you've already got a really good
It's great
emergency
to be terrified.
fund. But at the same time, I've got people who have $9,000 of credit card debt and no savings, and their payment's about to come, and they're like, I can't afford this. You need to fix this for me. And there's not, I mean, we can't we can't perform magic in terms of student loans, unless your income is at a certain level, you're going to have to make some form of payment. But these income driven repayment options exist for people to be able to manage a payment when you're working at a job that you're passionate about, but maybe isn't paying what you'd prefer.
I don't know. Reducing a payment from 1110 to 196, that does sound like magic to me.
I mean, it's not zero, but it's pretty magical. So I've seen things like that with a couple that is always married, filing jointly, have always filed jointly in their taxes. And if we talk about separating the income, it could go from $1,300 or even $4,000 a month to $2,000 a month. I mean, I've seen very drastic changes in terms of, feeling crippled by your debt doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Sometimes there aren't options to fix things, but for the most part, looking into income-driven repayment is worth it. So let's move forward from looking at the standard 10-year, looking at your other options. So next, I think, becomes the question of, are we choosing one of these income-driven repayment plans, which is repay, pay as you earn, or IBR, IB as in boy, R, or the standard 10-year. So that was what we just went through. Now comes the question of public service loan forgiveness or not, and or refinance or not. So ultimately what this comes down to is just a calculation of what are you going to pay the most on. So if you work for a government entity, you're a teacher, or you work for a nonprofit, public service loan forgiveness is absolutely worth checking out. What it looks like is actually an umbrella on top of one of the income-driven repayment plans. So it's not separate from them. It would be in addition to an income-driven repayment plan. So let's say your best option was pay as you earn. PSLF would sit on top of that. So it's just an extra form that you need to send in to verify that you're actually employed where you say you're employed, but you need to do all of the other income-driven repayment things like recertifying your income on an annual basis. I'll tell you, 11 times out of 10, if you work for a nonprofit, PSLF is the best option for you. Like, I haven't seen it where that's not the best option. But now we have to talk about life and what's realistic for a person and their happiness. If they've worked for a nonprofit for 6 years but are miserable and want to double their income by going into the for-profit space, you can actually do the math of what the difference, basically how much more money do you need to make per year to ensure that leaving PSLF is worth it. So it's a very important message to get out there that public service loan forgiveness is an incredible repayment option out there, but you shouldn't sacrifice your happiness and stay in a job you don't like in order to achieve it.
I think that's one of kind of my next bigger series of questions is, what if I don't work for a qualified employer, either halfway through or from the beginning? Like, are there options available if I have everything's the same? Maybe I make 15% more, but I work at a for-profit company.
So that's a great question. It doesn't mean income-driven repayment is off the table. There are longer terms of forgiveness available. It's just that it's taxable. So let me explain that. So say we're sticking with pay as you earn, which we were just talking about in the public service loan forgiveness option. Pay as you earn looks like the best option. Essentially, you're going to have low payments as long as your income doesn't drastically increase. And, I just use the $45,000 or so of income, $100,000 balance, and a single person. So we're just going to stick with that exact same example. So under pay as you earn, your total payments, pay as you earn is a 20-year program if you don't do public service loan forgiveness. So under that, again, all of this is estimates, you would pay about $74,000 of your $100,000 over 20 years. So you don't even pay your full balance. You have a remaining balance forgiven of close to $150,000. And the issue there is that is taxable in the year that it is forgiven. Caveat, actually, President Trump put this into place that through 2025, it sunsets in 2025, the taxes due, which would be about $60,000 the year your loans are forgiven, is waived. So the fact that it's in the legislation through 2025 means that it's more likely to be extended. So what I'm saying is there's an option that your long-term forgiveness, or in this case, 20 years, is tax-free as well.
Is that the same, like, has to be a direct loan and yes, you have to be on an income-driven repayment plan?
The only caveat there is that FFEL loans, the old loans that we talked about at the very beginning, can get on income-based repayment, or IBR. That's 15% of your discretionary income. So they would follow the same forgiveness pattern. IBR in general is 25 years. So for those who have been in FFEL loans for 20 years and have been on IBR for 20 years, please don't consolidate and change to another repayment plan, because that resets your clock. So if you've been on an income-driven repayment plan for 20 years and you only have 5 years left before forgiveness, don't make any changes. But I'm generally speaking with new borrowers or newer borrowers, or maybe you have FFEL loans and have had them for a while and have kept deferring and putting your loans back into forbearance so you don't have to make any payments yet. Those are the people that should consider consolidation. If you have years of credit already on your FFEL loans, don't make a change.
Okay, so if I work for a for-profit company, I use an IDR or IBR, it is still possible that 20 or 25 years down the road, there's some loan forgiveness, but I'm planning on being taxable. It's possible that it's not taxable.
Yeah, so generally what we recommend, when I say we, I moonlight on Tuesdays. I do student loan consults for a company called Student Loan Planner. And so that's what I mean when I say we. It's a great free resource for people to go out and check a lot of blog posts and things like that. But the total cost of the loan payback, so we're going back through the $100,000 version. You pay $74,000, you have $150,000 forgiven. Your taxes due would be about $60,000 if they're due. So what do we do about that? How do we save for that? The good news is we have 20 years to save for that. The cost in today's dollars of the loan is about $66,000. So you pay $66,000 on your $100,000 of student loans. That's just using a 3% inflation rate and bringing it back to today's dollars. So loan forgiveness is in 2041, 20 years from today. And what we recommend doing is saving money on a monthly basis into a taxable brokerage account, just in case. So in that case, it would be $160. You would pay $160 a month into Betterment or whatever you decide to use, Wealthfront, Vanguard, I mean, any kind of taxable brokerage account. You would save that $160 a month. You could do $100 a month to start with, or, $200 a month if you wanted to be aggressive. Worst case, you got to pay the tax bill. Best case, you've saved a bunch of money for yourself over 20 years.
Did you say what the payment difference would be? So started at $1,110, but at a private company, what did the payment come down to?
So under pay as you earn, this is that example of the payment went from $1,110 to $196.
Oh, okay. So it's still the same, based on the same salary.
Yep.
Okay. So the qualified employer didn't matter.
I have income growing. Exactly. I have income growing from 45 at about a 5% rate. So worst case, if you're doing pay as you earn, your payment gets up to just under $500 a month.
Okay.
But your income is also increased with that. So basically you're going from $0 if you had zero income in 2020 to up to $500 or so a month versus $1,110.
Okay. So if you work for a for-profit company, plan on that future taxes by saving and investing a portion of that big difference of the savings on the loan payment.
Yes.
Which is just nice, prudent financial advice anyways. If you've reduced your loan payment, you should be saving and investing that anyways. Right, Trishul?
It makes sense to me. And just to be clear, though, just the amount of money you get forgiven, you just pay your marginal tax rate on that amount.
Correct. It's basically considered part of your AGI in the year it's forgiven. So we always do 35% tax rate, like pretty much the highest tax rate. And we also add a state tax rate in there as well, because, if you're getting $150,000 forgiven and you already have an income of 100 or 200, then you're going to be at the highest tax rate. So basically, it might not be that high, but we like to plan it that way, so that you have, plenty of money to pay the tax bill if you need to. But a lot of people aren't comfortable with 20 or 25 years of low student loan payments, knowing their balance is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Or, maybe their balance is low enough that it'll be paid off. And so a very small percentage would be forgiven. So those are the people where maybe you start to think about refinancing. Notice we had a whole long conversation before I bring up refinancing. So a lot of people think I get out of school and I've got to refinance. My experience with refinancing was interest rates were different in 2013 versus where they are now. But when I got out, based on the income that I had at the time, I applied with SoFi. I didn't know there were a bunch of other lenders that could be trusted. And so I trusted SoFi. And my rates were 6.8 and 7.9. The refinancing rate that I was quoted was like 6.2. So in my mind, it wasn't worth all the extra legwork to not get that much better of a rate. People today are seeing sub 4 as their interest rate in terms of refinancing. And so know that, 75% of your time should be spent on what can I do in the federal system? Because if you lose your job, if you are in any way disabled, if you die with your debt, federal loans are way more friendly than going private. So if you lose your job, you just call them and say, I need a forbearance, and they will put you on a forbearance. If that happens with your private loans, it depends on the promissory note, but you might not have that kind of freedom. If, you, for example, have loans and you took them out for your children and you're older and you're about to go on Social Security, there are options as far as on the income driven side. So if your income was $400,000 before you retire and it's about to go drastically down, income driven repayment might be a great option for you. Or just, basically choosing a consolidation and going into a graduated or 30-year repayment schedule. Because if you pass away with federal student loans, they go away. They're not stuck with your loved ones. Versus, in the private realm, once you move to one of these private companies, the greater rate or the lower rate might seem really enticing, but your spouse or your loved ones might be stuck with that debt if anything were to happen to you. So there's a lot to think about before you go private, I guess, is my point there.
How often, like, what's your guess as to how often the benefit's worth it? 'Cause, like you said, that's a big interest rate difference.
Yes. So, here's an option. Here's a scenario where refinancing makes sense. We generally say that you want to owe, less than 1.5 times your income. So your debt to income ratio is really important. Essentially, so if you're getting out of medical school and you're a resident and you're going to be working for a nonprofit hospital for the next 3 to 4 years, and then maybe you have a fellowship for a couple years after that. So maybe you have 7 years where you're going to be making $50,000 to $60,000 a year and working for a nonprofit hospital. Generally speaking, absolutely go for public service loan forgiveness and use an income-driven repayment plan during that time. Because if you get out of your fellowship and maybe an internship or whatever else is involved before you can actually start being a doctor, sometimes that's 10 years. And you could basically make no payments and have all of your maybe $600,000 debt forgiven. If you get out of medical school and you're a plastic surgeon and you get finished with all that and your income goes from basically, 40 or 50,000 to 500,000, then refinancing is your answer. Income-driven repayment's not going to help you very much. So it's very, very dependent upon what your outlook is after graduation. The reason I stayed in the federal system was that my income ranged from $60,000 to $125,000 in 6 years. So I didn't want to refinance when I was making 60. My debt to income didn't look good because I had $125,000 worth of debt and I had 60,000 of income. If I had, it's so funny because I did what I did because that's all I knew. I probably would have gone on income-driven repayment at the beginning. With that lower amount of income, my payment would have been a couple $100 a month. It would have been significantly lower than what I was paying, which was $1,400 a month. But I was really afraid of interest because I had the typical debt response, which is debt is bad. We have to get rid of it. It's like a credit card debt. It's horrible. I can't have this. I didn't know about the forgiveness provisions. I just didn't know so much. So I think that when it comes down to should you leave or not, there's not a hard and fast rule. I also just knew I wanted to get rid of it. And sometimes I talk to people who just don't really want to talk about forgiveness. They just want to be rid of it. That it's definitely worth looking at refinancing in that vein. I think that getting multiple quotes is something I didn't do, but I certainly would have done. So companies like Credible will run and get you multiple quotes. You can do like a 2-minute, fill out some general information about yourself. It's a soft credit check. It's not a hard credit check until you actually apply. You could get an idea of what your rates would be, of what your payment would be. So that's a way potentially to solve for if income-driven repayment is not giving you a payment that you like. Private refinancing, ironically, might be the answer in terms of it gives you a smaller payment that over maybe a 20-year period. And then you could always refinance again to a shorter period and a higher payment if your income situation changes. So that's something that Student Loan Planner calls the refinancing ladder, where you could start with a 20-year and then do a 15-year and then do a 10-year, or just overpay essentially your 20-year in order to save some more interest. But
yeah, the way you talk about the emotions, I've observed a similar thing with clients. Usually they have investments either from company stock or that they've saved up, and they're asking like, can we pay off our mortgage? And I talk about like kind of the classic, well, if the rate of return on your investments is greater than the interest rate on your mortgage, your net worth maximization strategy is to leave the money invested. But it is a more conservative, safer strategy to take out the investment risk and just pay off the mortgage. And they consistently express almost like this relief that like their life is better because they don't have that debt. And I imagine it's similar to that student loan. That's just like there's kind of a greater sense of freedom or control or agency. Like they genuinely appreciate having have paid that off.
I'll tell you from personal experience, it feels incredible to have that paid off. And even though legally there shouldn't be, it doesn't mean that clients don't have uncertainties when it comes to, will this actually be forgiven? What does it actually look like 2 decades from now? And same thing with public service loan forgiveness. Even though it's 10 years out, there's so many boxes you have to check and so many things you have to file on an annual basis. If you forget one of those things, you'll get some grace in the process, but I think there's a lot of fear that you'll go through all of this work and then it won't be forgiven, because that's what the news is saying, that nobody's getting forgiven in public service loan forgiveness. We essentially haven't tested the longer forgiveness yet. We don't have a lot of data on that because it hasn't been 20 or 25 years, essentially.
Oh.
So as far as public service loan forgiveness, most of that you read in the news are people who just applied without having checked any of the boxes and hoped for the best. And you're going to get rejected because that's how it operates. But so I understand the anxiety around the longer term plans, but it's just like anything in financial planning. You can explain on paper what makes the most sense, but that doesn't mean that it's the right fit.
Yeah.
For somebody's personality or what they feel most comfortable with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trishul, did you have a...
Yeah, I can understand how that might get a little tricky, because also my understanding is if you do end up refinancing and going private, it's a one-way street, meaning, for example, even this time, you may have missed out on the forbearance if you had done the refinance before all this happened.
Exactly. There was actually a lot of discussion on that, and a discussion amongst all of us have a little side gig with Student Loan Planner where we all work together one day a week or so. And there was a lot of, if the economy's starting to do better, then is it better to refinance now for fear that in October rates might be significantly higher? Do you need to balance that? And we were really talking about that earlier this year. Now there's not as many months until COVID forbearance is up, and actually one of the lenders went through and did a 6-month, no interest accrual period, zero interest period, to entice people to leave the federal. You still have to make payments, but it's zero interest during that period. And so, so you've got these private lenders enticing you to leave in order to get that rate. And sometimes the math is really easy. Like, you should just definitely refinance. But I just ultimately still think it's a person by person case, because if you're really enjoying the zero interest and zero payment because your savings is building up, not because you're just spending more, then it's worth staying, and kind of taking the risk. You can always overpay in the federal system. I guess something we haven't mentioned is you cannot get a lower rate in the federal system. It's not possible. But rates change according to time. So mine were 6.8 and 7.9. Since then, interest rates went down across the globe, basically. So a lot of people that I'm talking to that have more recent loans have 4 to 5% loans. In that case, the refinancing thing is not so black and white.
Yeah.
I've also seen loans that have 9%, and maybe people that borrowed private loans that have 9 or 10%. You can refinance your private loans, provided, you've got good credit and your debt to income ratio looks right. And underwriting costs in student loans, there isn't underwriting costs. So like when you refinance a mortgage, there's underwriting costs you have to consider. That doesn't exist in the student loan space. So it's worth looking at if you have. I've seen a lot of private loans that are 9 or 10%, and that's getting close to a credit card. You really want to see if you can get a lower rate than that with your federal, basically, because that's what you can do with private, is only refinance them to a lower rate or pay them off. Yeah. You can't, do a lot of the other things you can do.
You also get it's not necessarily a great idea, but you can also extend the term, and that will also reduce your payment.
Yes.
Thank you, Molly. That was a lot. Is there any other kind of final thought that you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll tell you, like, for my company, I help people with their student loans as part of comprehensive financial planning. But if you're not ready, if you're listening and you're not ready for like the full financial planning package that Trishul or Aaron or I use, there are student loan companies out there. And I think one thing to be aware of is that a lot of those are pushing you to refinance. And so, you might take some sort of a call with a student loan company, and they're saying that they're going to provide the solution to your student loans, but they're going to push you to refinance. And I would just say, remember that there are all these other options. And the work I do with Student Loan Planner is not a push to refinance. We're going to look at all the other options first. I basically went through a consult on this call, all of the things I told people to look out for. So I think that it's, if you're going to get help, I think working with a certified financial planner is a great idea. I also think, again, I don't want to pump Student Loan Planner too much, but they're a company that I was a fan before I started consulting with them. And I think that, there's so many blog posts and podcasts and things that you can listen to from Student Loan Planner that'll be free resources for people that are interested if they're not ready to book a consult. But I mean, I think just buyer beware of any kind of student loan company that you hire, because very often they get income from refinancing or from getting you to refinance. And so their conflict is really heavy there.
And if someone did want to contact you for the full financial planning services, how would they find you?
Laughterfinancial.com is my website.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Molly. We really appreciate you coming in and like really explaining all the depth and complexity that just Trish and I would not have been capable of going down.
I think some people's heads might explode even more from listening to this, because it was a lot to cover in a short amount of time. But it's something you can tell that there are people out there like me who made mistakes and are really passionate about it now, because it's a system that can be, you can do things to make your payment lower. You can do things to kind of beat the system. But not many people know that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Molly.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We really appreciated having you on.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we'll have to do it again next year for something else.
Or in October.
Right on. I look forward to it. And thanks, everybody, for listening. If you're enjoying these conversations, do spread the word. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.